Hello, Words of J2012 here, and welcome back to another installment of Movie Shack, where I take a look at all kinds of movies and share my thoughts on them. However, for this particular episode, it's a special one in that instead of doing a review on one specific movie, I decided that I'd take a look and do a thoughts on all the movies in a certain series. In today's case, it's going to be a big one, since it's going to be covering one of the biggest and most popular video game franchises. That's right, I'm talking about the Pokémon movies. If you're not familiar with the Pokémon series, then where have you been for the past 100 years or so? For an incredibly quick history lesson, it's a massively popular role-playing game series by Nintendo and Game Freak, where you control a Pokémon trainer with their Pokémon, going around the world fighting other Pokémon, sometimes capturing them, befriending them, and battling gym leaders so that you can become a Pokémon Master. The series started in 1996 for the Game Boy with Pokémon Red and Green, later released as Pokémon Red and Blue outside of Japan, and it became a hit. Eventually it spawned other games, some more finished than others, merchandise, an anime series, a trading card game, and the subject we'll be talking about today, movies. Now here's the thing with the movies. Opinions for these movies are all over the place, from people praising them to critics not liking them at all, and looking at ranking lists for these movies are never consistent. However, I enjoy playing the games from time to time, and the anime can have moments of greatness, but as for someone who has little to no expectations for each of these films, what do I think of each of them? Let's find out, starting with the first movie. Well, the first movie. Obviously. If you know about this movie, you'll know that it is very infamous. It was slammed by critics when it was first released, and it even received a Stinker Award for Worst Achievement in Animation. Though in all honesty, I think they might have had a huge hate bias toward the series. However, with the internet, people are having a bit of a re-evaluation with this movie, with some even considering it a nostalgic animated classic. Well, frankly, no, I'm on the negative side of the spectrum. This movie sucks. It could have been half decent with its great animation, cool battles, interesting setup about Ash being invited to battle the world's greatest Pokemon trainer, Mewtwo's backstory, and a pretty great soundtrack, even if Brother My Brother is a pretty unfitting song. But this movie decided to make the villain, Mewtwo, such a cliched mustache-twirling villain stereotype, with nothing to avert the trope, and Mewtwo doesn't even have a mustache! Aside from Team Rocket, the jokes were mostly lame, especially the Minnesota Vikings joke.
Strong! 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 Oh, I think I'm gonna have one.
I didn't know Vikings still existed.
They mostly live in Minnesota.
Would you shut the fuck up?
The ending is pretty anger-inducing, where Mewtwo basically erases the memories of everyone, giving it Sonic 06 vibes. The Pokemon Tears scene to bring Ash back to life was meant to be a serious moment, but it just ended up silly and I can't take it seriously. Plus it doubled as a Deus Ex Machina, and it basically shoves down the message of how we shouldn't fight down our throats.
Pokemon aren't meant to fight. Not like this.
There's only two problems with this though. Number one, you're really terrible with the show don't tell ideology. Make your message subtle instead of forcing it down our throats. And number two, you're telling us this anti-violence message with Pokemon. You know, a series based all around fighting and battling other kinds of Pokemon. It makes this movie extremely hypocritical and I can't forgive it for that. It legit makes me piss. It's like making a Family Guy episode with a message telling you to be a decent human being. You just can't do that. On top of that, it's not a very good movie to start off the series if you're not familiar with the Pokemon anime. Going in as a newcomer, you'll have no idea how things are. Like, suppose you're watching this movie for the first time and had zero knowledge on the Pokemon anime, or series even. Who is Ash? Who is Misty? Who is Brock? What are all these Pokemon? What is their purpose? How do the battles work? It's not a very good intro piece is what I'm trying to get across. It may not be one of the worst movies I've ever seen, maybe not enough for a stinker in all honesty, considering all the other films that were released around that time, but it's still pretty crap, and certainly not as good as your nostalgia might want you to believe. Is it weird that I think Digimon the movie, in spite of its flaws, was a better movie than this? I mean, it was part of the 5-star selection, so it must be. Since I was left somewhat disappointed with the first movie, I was honestly worried that 2000 might suck too. Thankfully, this isn't the case. I thought the story was actually interesting and more exciting in this one, especially with the different and more interesting locations that we get to see in this movie. The new character, Melody, admittedly was pretty cute and quite fun. The humor was actually a little better here too, and I actually giggled whenever they talked about Ash and Misty being a couple, or Ash being the frozen one.
Yeah, you're right. I can do it. I'm the chosen one. Right now, I feel more like the frozen one.
I know it's a stupid thing to laugh at, but considering I barely laughed in the first one in an intentional way, it's something. And of course, Team Rocket is always a highlight. Plus, this movie focused on 4 different legendaries: Articuno, Zapdos and Moltres, and Lugia, which I felt made it a little more exciting, just like how Ash actually has a lot more to do in this one than in the first movie, which I must say, it's pretty great to see. Does this movie have flaws? Of course it does. I did feel like this movie's villain, Lawrence III, it's kinda cliched, and felt like one of those villains who wants to capture animals, in this case the legendaries Articuno, Zapdos and Moltres, as well as Lugia, for his personal gain. And since he didn't appear that much compared to Mewtwo, he kinda felt more forgettable than him. The story with its fetch quest trope also felt a little bit you know where it was going too. But I suppose it's not the kind of trope I hate all that much, since I always felt it's more about the journey rather than the destination. I'm also not a fan of Professor Ivy's voice. She just sounded tired throughout the entire movie. Maybe she might need some monster energy to wake her up. Pocket monster energy. Shut up, me. Overall, while this movie isn't quite a home run, I do think this movie is a pretty big improvement over the first movie. You might as well start it with this movie anyway, especially when you take into account the ending of the first movie. I'm still angry about that. Wow, I actually wasn't expecting to enjoy this one as much as I did. We're 3 Pokemon movies in, and already I think I found one of the best ones. In this one I found the story to be the most exciting and unpredictable, with Molly's dream world conjured up by the Unown, and seeing all the different locales within this dream world. The fact that it wasn't a cliched or stereotypical villain in this one also definitely helped with my enjoyment of this one. And also, excluding Team Rocket's antics, which were as great as ever, there wasn't any cringy humor to ruin the seriousness of the situation. The battles that were featured were also the most intense yet, and actually was pretty nail-biting at points. The animation in this one is probably the best out of the Pokemon movies so far, especially with not just the 2D animation, but also with the CGI work done here. Yeah, sure, it might not look spectacular by today's standards, but who cares? I think it looks really cool, and especially impressive for the time. I also really love the work done on the backgrounds, as well as all of the crystallized areas. I can definitely imagine that took a lot of effort to try and perfect. As for the characters, man, they hit really deep. I actually felt really sorry for Molly in this movie. She was so sweet, and it must really suck for her father to go missing, and for her being stuck in a dream world done by the Unown where she imagines Entei to be her dad, as cool as that sounds, and Ash's mother to be Molly's mother. And I really loved the development she went through, from being stuck inside a bubble to learning to come out of it eventually. Nearly made me shed a tear. As for Entei himself, he's really awesome too, and an absolute unit. He also has some pretty good development, from being a stern creature to being more understanding, especially thanks to Molly. Overall, this movie is absolutely fantastic, and feels like a breath of fresh air compared to the previous 2 movies. Out of the first 3 movies, this feels like the best of the trilogy. I would say it's the best Pokemon movie, but I still got 22 more movies to go before I come to that conclusion, so hold on to your socks. I know technically this isn't considered as one of the Pokemon movies as we know it, like the ones before this and since, but I feel like I'd get mad at myself if I didn't include it. And besides, if Kedden from Marvy Derrick can include it, so can I.
I mean, you got Pokemon the first movie, Pokemon the movie 2000, Pokemon the movie 3, Pokemon Mewtwo Returns.
See? This movie is a sequel to Pokemon the first movie, featuring the whereabouts of Mewtwo and the Pokemon clones after the end of that movie. However, Giovanni, the man that trained Mewtwo in the first movie, wants to get Mewtwo back so that he can create an army of Pokemon and use them for his bidding. Ash, Misty and Brock also try to get Pikachu back after Team Rocket steal him away from them. The chase leads them to finding Mewtwo's haven for the cloned Pokemon. Sometimes I feel the movie had some pacing issues, like some parts feeling slow for an hour-long movie, but aside from that, I thought it certainly was a more interesting plot than its predecessor, with a bit complex, which I didn't quite expect for a direct-to-video special. However, what I did expect was great animation. Unfortunately, I didn't quite get that. Don't get me wrong, the animation in this movie is good, it's just not amazing. While the Pokemon movies have pretty awesome and cinematic animation, this one just looks kinda like an episode of the series for the most part. And yes, I am aware that this isn't one of the movies, it's an hour-long special, but if we can't get movie budget, it would be nice if we had something that looked in between the show and movies. I did also notice an animation goof where the clone Pikachu's mouth was left floating, which I thought was kinda messy. The characters are where this movie shines the most for me though. Mewtwo went from being the stereotypical mustache twirling villain to being a sympathetic creature who genuinely cares for the clone Pokemon that he made. Giovanni went from being this unmemorable guy that we only saw in the first 10 minutes to train Mewtwo and that's it, to being a legitimate threat. And seeing Ash, Misty and Brock meeting him for the first time made it feel more impactful and memorable. There is another villain in this movie though, Domino. She's another member of Team Rocket, just like Jessie, James and Giovanni, and I thought she was legitimately threatening compared to the former two, especially since she's working with Giovanni, and then I thought she's kinda cute admittedly. Overall, this movie is a solid continuation to a pretty crappy first movie. It's by no means a masterpiece, it is a direct-to-video movie after all, but it had plenty of improvements such as characters, no hypocritical message, and even an ending is better for me to recommend it to people, even if it isn't one of the main films. Plus, it has Brock's trusty drying pan, so of course it would be the better movie by default anyway.
Oh no, it's raining!
Hey, I know. I'll use my trusty frying pan as a drying pan.
For this one, I thought the idea of there being time traveling elements with Sam going through 40 years in time from the past to the future was pretty fascinating. The location in this movie, a forest with Pokemon, feels nice to see. Celebi just might be my favourite mythical so far. One of the most adorable. I love the chemistry between him and Sam. I also like the fact that unlike the other legendaries and mythicals in the movies preceding it, neither Celebi nor Suicune actually speak English, but yet she still understood how they felt through their facial expressions and body language. Jessie, James and Meowth, who are usually comic reliefs, and still are in this movie, actually help the villain, the Iron Masked Marauder, thus making them an actual threat for once, even if it's for a little bit. And of course, the battles and display are excellent and full of thrills. This movie was also a bit of a tearjerker, with the stuff happening with Celebi and Sam. This is also, appropriately, the fourth movie I cried at. The only real flaw I could say about this movie is that the villain, the Iron Masked Marauder, although great and legitimately threatening, is a bit cliched since, like Lawrence III from Pokémon 2000, he wants to capture rare Pokémon for his personal gain. However, it more than makes up for there being a Dark Ball, which makes any Pokémon captured inside the evil, thus raising the stakes a bit. And even Celebi looks kinda creepy. I mean, look at him. He makes him look like he's from The Shining.
Come play with us.
Although one thing I can say is a definite improvement is that this is the first Pokemon movie to actually feature the backstory of Ash and the ideology of Pokemon as a whole, which I think is good for newcomers to the series. It just kinda sucks that it took 4 movies to see that, but still, better late than never. In conclusion, while not as good as 3, mainly due to 3 having a more interesting locale, this is still a great entry Pokemon movie, and it's definitely a fun time, as well as an emotional one. I know I love Celebi, but this movie made me love him even more. I do wonder why critics are harsh with these movies now, but I guess I'm not one of them. I bet if IGN were to watch this movie, they'd be bitching about how much water it has. This movie's setting is probably one of my favorites in the Pokemon movies so far, that being the city of Altamar, a water city resembling Venice, which to be fair, looks like a great place to visit on holiday. This movie's villains, Annie and Oakley, were pretty threatening and cunning by stealing the Soul Dew and effectively controlling the city, and they've had a bit of originality in them compared to most of the Pokemon movies we had so far, which I definitely appreciate. The legendaries in this movie, Latios and Latias, are absolutely awesome. Not only are their designs really cool and kinda cute with Latias, but their powers are also amazing. They can share their visions between each other, which is great to check if they're in trouble, but they can also disguise themselves as a human, like what Latias does, by transforming to her owner Bianca. And I must say, the chemistries between the characters, be it with Latios and Latias, them and Bianca, or Latias and Ash, they're all really sweet. And oh boy, this movie has such big feels. When you see the ending, you'll know exactly what I mean. My main complaints for this movie here is that this movie is really short, at only 68 minutes, and I also felt that Misty and Brock felt underutilized. Sometimes I forgot they were even in the movie. The fact that this is the last time Misty tags along for Ash's movie adventures doesn't help either. And as for the animation, well, it was as great as ever, with the details, combination of 2D and CGI, and moments like the vision sharing. I did feel like the blue filter throughout this was a bit unnecessary. Maybe it was just an issue with the version I watched, so don't take that last criticism too seriously. But still. But as it stands as a Pokemon movie, I'd say this is another great outing. I did find it a little better than Forever in moments, and for the last Pokemon movie to be theatrically released in the US, I say they chose a wise pick. Man, Altamar sounds like a great place to visit. I should probably book tickets for a flight there one day. Wait, what? This place is fictional? Out of all the Pokemon movies, this is the one I remember the most. I watched it online when I was 10, and I ended up rewatching it when I picked up the DVD when I was a teenager. I remember it being a really sweet story, and it also helps that Jirachi was always my favorite legendary. Now that I'm revisiting this movie for a Pokemon movie binge, is it still as good as I remember it from watching it over 11 years ago? Yes, it is! There are many reasons why I always loved this movie as a kid. For example, the setting of a theme park is really great and imaginative and is always exciting to see. This is the first appearance of the Advanced Era characters, such as May and Max, and although May may not be as good as Misty, I thought she was still very much enjoyable. There's actually a lot more humor in this movie, and it's genuinely funny. I ended up having legitimate laughs in this one, and not just from Team Rocket. The villain in this movie, Butler, is actually very interesting, especially since unlike the other Pokemon movies, it isn't 100% obvious he is the villain, thus giving him a good amount of build-up. Essentially, he wants to get hold of Jirachi so he can use his energy to bring Groudon to life. However, I did like learning about the history between him and Diane. It kind of felt like a friendship you want to get back to, even if he's become evil. There's hope that you can snap him out, which thankfully he does. And boy, that final moment featuring the gang and the Pokemon from Furina against the resurrected evil Groudon is pretty epic. As for Jirachi himself, well, let's just say there's a big reason as to why I always considered him my favorite mythical. He has amazing powers, he actually has a rare chance of being seen, with the Millennium Comet being visible in the night sky and only appearing once every millennium, and man, he is one of the most adorable things I've ever seen. I've always loved whenever I saw him in Max on screen, and his voice sounds really cute and nice. And man, the ending. I know I repeat a lot about how the ending in the Pokemon movies are generally sad, but this one felt especially heart-wrenching. Just like Ash's quote about how even with your friends leave behind, a fragment of them stays with you. So with that, I'm very happy I got to rewatch it, and it's even better than I remember. It was genuinely funny, genuinely epic, the villain actually felt unique, and it made me cry harder than Forever even. I'm very happy this was the first Pokemon movie I've ever seen, and unlike the first movie, I can say the nostalgia for this one is justified. Yeah, I just said that. I don't care if you have any pitchforks or torches, I'm immune to them. For this particular movie, I didn't know exactly what to expect, but I was expecting to see a better Pokemon movie. Don't get me wrong, this movie isn't by any means awful, it's just, compared to the previous few movies preceding it, it felt like a bit of a step back. Not quite a huge one like from Shrek 2 to Shrek the 3rd, but still. The setting of this movie is a futuristic city called La Rousse, filled with different robotic contraptions, conveyor belts, burger dispensers, etc. I really do enjoy this concept, and I probably would put it at number 2 in the list of locations in the Pokemon movies so far. Movies like these tend to include a new kid in them as a general rule. 3 had Molly, Forever had Sam, and Heroes had Bianca, and this movie features Tori. He's got a fear of Pokemon ever since he was a kid and got scared by a Pokemon stampede. However, he eventually gets over them. I don't know how to feel about him. I mean, he's perfectly fine I guess, and I like his design, but he feels kinda weak compared to the previous kids. The animation is great as always, aside from some CGI moments with some Pokemon rendered that way. They looked off to me. I understand the CGI is still technically early at the time, but it just looks dated now. However, I must say the Aurora in the movie looks beautiful and holds up really well. Blew me away. One other thing to know is that this is the first Pokemon movie to go beyond 80 minutes, and it sure feels that way. Sometimes this movie's pace can be broken, like with the moments featuring Munchlax throwing trash away. I know all the Pokemon movies were directed by the same director, so I can appreciate that he tries something different, but you can easily tell he's trying to get used to this longer length shtick. Then we got the movie's legendaries, Deoxys and Rayquaza. For Deoxys, I have to say, his design looks really cool. I really like his powers, and his way of communicating with other Deoxys is... what's the plural for Deoxys? It's pretty interesting. His backstory is also fascinating. He was a Pokemon from space that crash landed on Earth inside a meteor, and Rayquaza mistakes this as him invading his territory, and thus they have a feud with each other. However, later on in the film, he takes over LaRouche City, so I guess in a way, this Deoxys is sort of a de facto villain. I mean, he does bad things, but not with bad intentions. I guess that's cool, and it's better than making him twirl his hypothetical mustache like Mewtwo. But I feel like this legendary isn't that memorable compared to the ones we saw previously. So overall, I'd say this movie is fine. It didn't make me overjoyed, it didn't make me pissed, it was perfectly acceptable as a Pokemon movie. It's such a shame that after the amazing Jirachi Wishmaker came a movie that was just okay. Maybe on a rewatch it could be better, but for now I just think it's okay. I'll tell you what's not okay though. Team Rocket goes through all this and they ate bugger all. At least spare Jessie a drumstick. It's a me, Lucario. I actually really enjoyed the theming for a decent amount of this particular movie entry, in that it's got a medieval theme. The setting of the Cameron Palace is very cool and also really huge. I can just imagine how much work it would have had to try and design the entire building and interiors. The other setting, the Tree of Beginning, also looks nicely designed and expansive. I do like the different details it has and all the caverns and pathways there are. This movie's also got improved pacing. I felt like Destiny Deoxys has pretty inconsistent pacing, but thankfully in here, it was way better. This movie was 100 or so minutes, but it actually felt shorter, which shows the director has been improving with his pacing. Starting with this movie as well, I think the animation has gotten an improvement as well. We've gotten more saturated and clean colors, the backgrounds look a lot smoother, and there are actually more CGI shots in this movie. It's a good thing too, considering the CGI in this movie has had a big improvement over the last couple of years of movies. Seriously, it doesn't look primitive, it actually meshes with the 2D animation quite well. It is amazing to believe the CGI improving not just from 3 back in 2000, but also Destiny Deoxys. I just wish the CGI on the humans and background shots were a little better, but those are relatively rare compared to the great CGI backgrounds. Now, for this movie's main Pokemon, Lucario and Mew, I actually really appreciate these choices because Lucario is not a legendary, and Mew is a mythical we've already seen before. However, with the latter, I do appreciate how we get to see his powers put to use here, such as his power to transform to other Pokemon, and his power to teleport him and others. He even managed to get Pikachu easier than Team Rocket. Maybe I should have captured Mew instead. He's basically what we should have gotten in the first movie, and his design is of course very cute. As for Lucario, man, his backstory was pretty deep. Ever since his owner, Sir Aaron, abandoned him during a Pokemon war over a century ago, he grew a bit of a disdain towards humans, though he eventually outgrew to his hatred. He also has the power to sense auras, which becomes useful when Mew whisks both Pikachu and Meowth up to the Tree of Beginning. I really do believe that he was a great Pokemon, and he made for a great addition to Super Smash Bros. Brawl. And seeing the chemistry grow with Ash, and seeing Lucario see the past through the use of Time Flowers really felt impactful, like the Pokemon War, or seeing the whereabouts of Sir Aaron. And man, the ending is another very impactful one. Overall, this Pokemon entry was very enjoyable. The Pokemon used here were very memorable, the story, albeit a little bit overdone with the fetched quest trope, is engaging. The fact there is no real antagonist in this picture, similar to 3, is interesting. And it felt really cool to appreciate Lucario and why people like him. My biggest gripe though is that this movie, along with the next Pokemon movie, was never released in the UK on DVD. So if you live there and want to buy a copy, you'll just have to import it from America or somewhere. Or you could try other ways. Oh yeah, and one final thing to add, this is the last Pokemon movie to use the 4 kids' voices. So yeah, I am going to miss Veronica Taylor's Ash voice admittedly. To tell you guys the truth, this one felt like a really big disappointment, especially compared to the previous Pokemon movie. This movie's story goes something like this. Essentially, this movie is a glorified fetch quest to get to the Sea Temple so that the gang can get Manaphy, this movie's mythical Pokemon, back there. But there's a villainous pirate named Phantom who wants to use Manaphy to find the whereabouts of the Sea Crown so that he can be king of the sea. I am aware that that kind of story happened quite a few times in the Pokemon movies, including the previous one, and I can forgive it if it was at least entertaining. Unfortunately, this one felt slow. In some moments felt quite dragged out, and the fact this is the longest one yet doesn't help. Not even the action in this movie was that epic or awesome, which in a movie about Pokemon feels pretty inexcusable. This is the first Pokemon movie to feature the current voices of the Pokemon characters, and I feel like they're a mixed bag. I don't actually mind Bill Rogers' Brock voice in here. Sarah Natacheni's Ash voice sounds fine, although it is obvious that it is different. It kinda sounds older than Veronica Taylor's voice for Ash, but I do know it improves. As for May's voice, I'm not a big fan of Michelle Knotz's voice for her. They made her sound a bit too high for my liking. And man, I really don't like Casey Rogers' voice for Max. It sounds too nasally and the deliveries sound obnoxious with the inflections. At least the voices for Team Rocket sound more or less spot on, which is nice. I didn't like the voice for Jackie though, the Pokemon Ranger. Every time I heard him speak, I felt like he was so full of himself it hurts. I'm just gonna spit it out now. This movie's villain, the Phantom, is pathetic. He's basically a pirate with a funky beard who wants to use Manaphy, this movie's Pokemon, for his own personal gain by using him to steal the Sea Crown from the Sea Temple. I know Pokemon movies never had the strongest villains, but this one was weak as all hell. And I feel especially disappointed how we went from having movies with no villain but still feeling impactful, or a movie with a villain that eventually gets redeemed, to another villain who just wants to use Pokemon to have their way. And speaking of the Pokemon itself, Manaphy, I mean, he's cute and playful and all, but I feel like he could be pretty annoying sometimes, especially with his constant crying. I mean, but he is a baby, but so... And his favorite Owl House episode must be Once Upon a Swap, because one of his powers involves body swapping, which I'm just gonna come out and say that's not a favorite trope of mine. It feels like an overused trope, and seeing it being used for comedy like with Team Rocket felt like a cheap way for humor. I will say though, I did like the chemistry he had with May. It felt nice, but I also felt like he was trying too hard to be like the chemistry Max and Jirachi had. Overall, this Pokemon movie felt like a forgettable experience. This movie does have some good points, but I feel like you can get them in previous Pokemon movies and have them executed better. The story feels pretty slow, the Pokemon here is not that special, the villain is pathetic, and as a way of saying goodbye to May and Max in a Pokemon movie, they could have done it so much better. The animation is nice, and the setting of Underwater is pretty neat, but it's not enough for me to fully recommend this movie. This is the first movie to be set in the universe of Diamond and Pearl, as well as the 10th Pokemon movie to be released. And what do I think of Ash Ketchum and company's 10th cinematic outing? Not too shabby if I say so myself. The movie has one of the more complex plots in the Pokemon movies. To sum it up, while the gang is in Alamos Town, they discover that someone is causing nightmares for everyone, and Baron Alberto accuses Darkrai, a sinister-looking Pokemon that causes nightmares on anyone it attacks. However, during all this, the legendaries Dialga and Palkia are also having a feud against each other in another dimension, and is causing more of a rip of the space-time continuum as their battle progresses. So it's up to Ash and the gang to stop it before it's too late. I will admit that this kind of plot was a little different for Pokemon, and I very much appreciate that, even if it could be complicated to follow for some. The characters all vary for me. Alice was a nice and sweet character who had an interesting backstory with Darkrai. Baron Alberto was a bit of a dick who constantly spread lies about Darkrai like he believes in cancel culture. And I honestly feel like he's a bigger simp towards Alice than Brock even. And as for Tonio, I really like him. He's basically the son of the architect of the Space-Time Towers in Alamos Town, Goldie. And it's thanks to him where we get to learn the backstory between him and Alice, as well as the background behind Darkrai and his purpose. He's good in my books. This movie's titular Pokemon, Darkrai, man, his power is so amazing it's scary. When he attacks someone, he basically gives them nightmares. I'm not gonna lie, the nightmare that Ash has in this movie could really get under your skin. It almost feels like a horror in points. The fact his design looks pretty badass and his voice genuinely sinister definitely helps in giving him an edge. However, we'll get to learn on the chemistry between Darkrai and Alice, like when Darkrai saved Alice from falling off a cliff, or when Alicia, her grandmother, opens his heart. we learn that maybe he's not so evil like Baron Alberto makes him seem, and he does do a good job at defending the town during the final battle. The other legendaries that appear in the movie, Dialga, a deity for time, and Palkia, a deity for space, are absolute units, and they are the ones that crossed in between the dimensions and caused problems in Alamo City. I must say, they're a pretty amazing duo, and the action in this one is certainly way better and more intense than the previous Pokemon film. So yeah, I'd say this movie is another great effort in the Pokemon cinematic library. Filled with great legendary choices, stunning visuals, interesting story if a bit complex, I'd say this is one of the better ones. Even Dawn was a pretty good character, even if not as good as Misty or even May. I sure hope the next movie isn't a letdown. Well, what do you know? It ended up being a letdown. My expectations for this particular entry weren't very high from the get-go. I have a friend who loves Pokemon to bits, and he's actually the one that goes for advice on these films and helps me out. And even he didn't like this one very much. And boy, I can see why. I suppose I should start with what I enjoyed, since I'm not a negative Nancy. I will say the reverse world looks like a fascinating and cool place, and it sort of reminded me of the Null Void from Ben 10, however it has way more buildings and geometry, and some zero gravity areas too. Although I did kind of imagine it to look like an MC Escher painting, that would have been amazing, but as it stands, it's fine. The animation and action, as you would probably expect, is great, and I will say, Giratina, this movie's legendary, looks pretty awesome, and I also appreciate the fact it's trying to continue from the rise of Darkrai with Dialga and Palkia returning. As for the rest of this movie, well, the story felt relatively weak compared to the other entries we previously had, especially the previous one, which this is meant to be a continuation of. I don't know, it didn't feel quite as engaging, and I felt it could have been its own standalone film like they usually are. And although I think Newton Graceland is alright, I suppose, and his research on the reverse world is pretty intriguing, his voice left a bit to be desired. Also, I felt Brock had bugger all to do in this movie, which is unfortunate. Okay, I'm just gonna spit it out. Zero sucks. Yeah, he was an absolutely terrible villain. He's forgettable, cliched, looks way too edgy, and I hate him. But not in a fun way like you would normally do with a villain. At least Phantom from Temple of the Sea had some enjoyable moments, so he is somewhat memorable, even if he is pathetic. Hell, even Lawrence III or even Mewtwo were more tolerable as villains, because for as flawed as they can be, they were back when Pokemon was still in its infancy, and to be fair, Mewtwo had a pretty cool design and backstory. Zero, on the other hand, he just wants to use Giratina's powers to take over the reverse world and destroy the real world. What an original idea! So in a way I suppose Zero is an appropriate name, since that's how many shits I give about him. And as for this movie's mythical Pokemon, Shaman, man, I desperately wanted to like him. I really did. I love hedgehogs so much. They're adorable, so how could I not want to try and like him? Both his landform and skyform designs were cute, and his powers are kinda neat, I'll give him that. But man, was he one of the most cocky and dick-headed characters I've ever seen in a movie. I didn't like his voice and how annoying it was, and the way he acts and the way he expresses himself, as well as the fact that he, along with Dawn, treats Ash like a pushover and doesn't seem to care in the slightest. He just comes off as being so unlikable, and the fact that he never apologizes at the end is assault to an open wound. For someone called the Gratitude Pokemon, he sure doesn't seem very grateful. And granted, he was a bit better in the last 30 minutes, but you have to put up with him being such a right douchebag until then. I actually felt sorry for Ash in this film as a result. This movie had a few bright points, but overall it has way too many problems for me to have genuine enjoyment with. The villain sucks, the mythical Pokemon is a mean-spirited douchebag, the story feels weak compared to various other Pokemon movies, Ash was pretty much a punching bag, and overall it wasn't a very pleasant experience. Don't expect me to revisit this one anytime soon. I must say that this movie's gimmick with time travel is pretty cool. It wasn't the first time a Pokemon movie dealt with that topic, Forever was, but it was the first time Ash and the gang actually went back in time themselves, which is certainly fascinating to see, especially with the history of Machina Town, and the movie's action is pretty intense too, which is par for the course for these films. This movie's mythical Pokemon, Arceus, or Arceus depending on where you come from, well, look at him! If his really cool appearance doesn't convince you, then maybe the fact he's literally Pokemon God, who is able to create worlds, will. He's pissed because the Jewel of Life wasn't returned when he asked for it back, and the town of Machina Town betrayed him, and now he's out for revenge.
God is pissed!
He's got an interesting backstory, I would say he's intimidating, and his attacks make him seem that, but I feel his voice was wrong. I was expecting him to sound like how God usually sounds in cartoons, or possibly even the Bible game, but here it sounds a little higher than I thought. However, when you see him being mistreated by Marcus, you actually feel pretty sorry for him. There were some things I didn't like though. I understand that this is meant to be a sequel to Rise of Darkrai and Giratina and the Sky Warrior, but I'm honestly getting fed up with seeing Dialga, Palkia, and even Giratina again in these films consecutively. It's stuff like that that kind of prefers me having the standalone movie approach, where you can watch any of them in any order. But for this, you have to have seen the previous two to get the picture. It kind of puts some people out of the loop. I understand it's ambitious trying to do an arc with the Pokemon movies, but it just doesn't pay off in my opinion. Marcus was a pretty weak villain too. Granted, better than Zero from the last film, but I felt that he was introduced too late and had little build-up. If it wasn't showing him hiding the Jewel of Life before giving the staff to Sheena, it might have been more effective. Also, although Sheena is cute, I really didn't like her voice. Her deliveries always sound so monotonous and wooden, and it doesn't make me take her so seriously. But I suppose if I had to rank the trilogy of Diamond and Pearl movies, this would sit perfectly comfortably in the middle, next to the cool friend on the left, Rise of Darkrai, and the annoying friend Noe likes on the right, Giratina and the Sky Warrior. This movie ain't a masterpiece, but it is decent and enjoyable, and that's at least something I hoped to see. The story in this one is that Zoroark and Zorua escape from the clutches of Kodai, and before the Bokker World Cup, Kodai unleashes Zoroark, and she transforms into Raikou, Entei and Suicune, and wreaks havoc in Crown City, and Kodai tries to frame this on Zoroark, and it's up to Ash and the gang, along with Zorua, to try to reunite Zorua with his caretaker. Meanwhile, Kodai also wants to find a time ripple to improve his future prediction skills, but in doing so, it will also destroy the city of Crown City, like what happened 20 years ago. I actually found this plot to be pretty fun. I'd argue and say that it was more enjoyable romp than movie 10, as you will soon see. This movie's villain, Kodai, I thought was pretty unique. Sure, he might want to spread fake news, but I thought he was despicable in the right way. He has pretty interesting powers to see into the future, which he took from Celebi 20 years prior, and I actually felt that he was a legitimate threat. We had years of Pokemon villains that varied in quality, so to have one that actually tortured Pokemon, that had many plans up its sleeve, and tried to kill our heroes is quite commendable. I also enjoyed Carl and Rowena, and they had a lot of stories to tell about Crown City, which helped with the world building of the movie. The Pokemon Zorua and Zoroark share really nice chemistry, and they remind me a bit of Simba and Mufasa from The Lion King. Their powers are that they can transform into other humans and Pokemon. Now granted, this isn't the first time in a movie where we had Pokemon that did that. Latias and Mew from movies 5 and 8 respectively were, but I feel like this is the most prominent example and used to full effect. Zoroark was amazing. She was really powerful and she had a lot of emotion. I also felt like Zorua was really enjoyable to watch. Yes, he could be playful and mischievous at first, but he was still very much likable. See, Shaman? That's how you have a mythical with likability! As for the returning Pokemon legendaries and Celebi, I thought it was cool to see them again. It did kind of feel like rehashing, except for Raikou, but it's fine because I liked 3 and 4 ever, and to the movie's credit, they weren't just thrown in for the sake of referencing. They did have significance to the plot, being the guardians of the city and helping in the battle, which is pretty amazing. In conclusion, this movie was awesome. The characters are great, the story is interesting, the animation looks nice as ever, and for once, the villain actually meant a damn. I don't know if it's a stretch to call it the best Pokemon movie, but it certainly is the best of the Diamond and Pearl movies, and it's definitely a great send-off to Dawn and Brock, since he's not going to be one of the Ash's partners either. Man, I feel quite satisfied. What other movies can be next? Oh. The Pokemon Black and White movies? Oh. Wish me luck. We're now onto the Black and White era of Pokemon, and for the first and only time, they decided to release movie 14 with 2 different versions, just like how the games usually have 2 different versions. And no, I don't mean like something like Zack Snyder's Justice League. I mean releasing the same exact movie twice, with the same story, just with different aspects swapped around. Now you might think that sounds like a complete cash grab, and you'd be right, but I figured for the sake of completing my quest, I'd watch them both anyway. Man, this is probably one of the slowest movies I've ever seen. I know some Pokemon movies tend to have pacing issues, like movies 7 and 9, but in all fairness, this was back when the director wasn't used to making Pokemon movies around 90 to 100 minutes long. Now that we went through that whole generation's worth of movies that were mainly 90 minutes, you'd think they would get the hang of things. But this movie's plot feels dragged out and feels like a chore to watch. It also doesn't help that for most of the movie, nothing really happens, and there's barely any action in this one, which feels really lame. Speaking of lame, I felt the antagonist, Damon, was just that. We went from having Kogai, an antagonist who legit tried to frame another Pokemon to try and make them look bad, to yet another antagonist who wants to use the power of a Pokemon, in this case Victini, to restore the Kingdom of Vale, but he doesn't realize that in doing so, he also risks putting the town of Eindhoek in peril. You notice I didn't use the word villain in this. That's because although he is doing something bad, it's not for evil intentions. He also used Zekrom in black or Reshiram in white to aim him on his particular goal. I mean, granted, it is good that they didn't try to make him look too evil, but it just leaves him without him having anything special. This movie's mythical Victini is also not that good, to be honest. He's not awful, I mean, he has a cute design, but I feel like this mythical's powers are pretty basic. Essentially, he can become invisible, and he can heal and make Pokemon stronger using his powers. I mean, I guess that's pretty cool, but it sure ain't something like transforming to other Pokemon, or granting people wishes, or being literally God. To put it in layman's terms, he doesn't feel like a special Pokemon. To me, he's in the same league as Manaphy. Looks nice, but is ultimately a take it or leave it kind of thing. In fact, even Manaphy's body swap ability feels like it's more than what Victini can do. I will say though, Reshiram and Zekrom look really fun, and the action on screen for them can be fun, but it sucks how they barely get to be on screen compared to Victini, so it doesn't feel all that special in the long run. Now you might have noticed in this particular review that I said things like, it's not that special, doesn't have anything special, it's not that great and all that kind of stuff. Well, that's a perfect description for this movie. Maybe it's not as infuriatingly awful as something like movie 11, and the fact that Victini isn't a twat kinda helps, but man, this was so boring. I couldn't even say anything interesting about Iris or Sylan, since they didn't feel that special or do much or any significance either, and neither did Team Rocket. If you want something good, I guess the CGI paper book was pretty neat. But yeah, releasing the same film twice and releasing them alongside each other feels like a bigger cash grab than splitting the last installments of a movie series into 2 parts. I know the games do it, but it doesn't mean it has to be done in movie form either. You know what? I think I might apologize to the first movie. Sure, the animation looks as beautiful as usual, that's a given at this point, and the legendary's Pokemon designs look epic too, and it's nice that they're trying to go back to making shorter films. But those positives honestly don't forgive every other problem this movie has. This movie's mythical, Keldeo, I don't like him very much. For one, his design isn't all that great, and he kind of fits more in Equestria than Unova. But that aspect is relatively minor compared to what he did. He wants to prove to his friends, Cobalion, Terrakion, and Virizion, which side note are boring and one-note characters as they are, that he can defeat Kyurem. So during the night, he runs away to a mine to face him. He also lies to not only Kyurem, but to the Swords of Justice too, that he is brave and acts all so fine and mighty, when in reality he's afraid and cowardly. As a result, Kyurem freezes his friends and Keldeo runs away. So basically his friends got trapped in ice all because Keldeo was full of himself. Great! This movie's story felt incredibly basic. Ash and his friends encounter Keldeo, who wants to save his friends who are frozen in ice by Kyurem, so they head off to the mine to have a showdown with him. Considering the last few generations had a good bunch of interesting stories, some of which can be legitimately life-threatening, with exciting villains or even no clear villain, this is inexcusable. It also feels weird that there was that inconsistency with Iris and Axio getting frozen on the airship by the cryogonals, and later on, the airship is firstly fine, despite being frozen and being seen falling. The villain in this one is Kyurem, and even he sucks. He doesn't have any kind of traits to make him memorable, his voice isn't threatening, he's pretty pissy that Keldeo lied to him about being brave, and he's able to transform into black and white Kyurem. That does sound neat until you realize that the only way for that to happen is to fuse with either Reshiram or Zekrom, which doesn't happen here. Neither of them are even seen in this movie, so it counts as another inconsistency. But now we got the battle. It made me angry. We had this battle between Keldeo and Kyurem, which has signs of being promising, especially with Keldeo finally getting the secret sword. But then Kyurem accidentally shoots Ash and company, and Keldeo slices it in half with the secret sword. This injured him severely, but the thing is, he essentially gives up and Kyurem wins.
That was pointless.
It felt anticlimactic. I mean, I spent throughout the entire film wanting to see some hero kick some villain ass, and this is what I get? I don't care if I get to hear some crap about caring for your friends over gaining victory. It feels like a slap in the face for people that were expecting some sort of epic battle. Overall, this film sucked. Sorry to be blunt, but it did. The story is bland, the movie's characters are forgettable, the climax was terrible, and the inconsistencies were irritating. Not even Team Rocket could save it, because they were barely in it and had no dialogue. I'd rather watch the first movie, because at least that movie had a more memorable villain, even if he was cliched. The action was sort of fun, it had some charm, and in all fairness, the movie's flaws were due to the English dub mainly. This movie is how it was made originally, and for movie 15, it's awful. Think about it for a moment. I'd rather watch the movie with the hypocritical message. Maybe it's because I feel bitter from the last two movies, or maybe it's because I like Mewtwo, but this is probably the best of the black and white films, but it's still not perfect. I will say this movie has a bit of a more interesting plot than the last two movies. The Genesect decide to reside in the city of Pokémon Hills, original name I'm aware, but they don't realize that they're threatening the city, and the fact that they've attracted Mewtwo's attention, yep, Mewtwo returns, since their origins share similarities to them. But the Red Genesect, the leader of the Genesects, doesn't trust Mewtwo, and the two have a row about it, threatening the safety of the city. This movie could sometimes have some pacing issues, but I didn't feel that they were distracting, nor felt like a snail's pace. It's fine. The action in this movie I would actually say is better than the last two movies as well, seeing as how it doesn't feel like a complete waste of time, and there's no anticlimax. And there's a superb message about how no matter who you are or where you're from, you should be friends, since both Mewtwo and Genesect were made by humans on Earth, which I like. One thing I didn't like though was Eric. I didn't find him all that interesting. I mean, sure, he's got this Pokemon park there, but I couldn't really remember what traits he has, and I tend to forget he's even got involvement with the story. Let's get to talking about the prominent Pokemon in this movie, starting with Mewtwo. I must say, it feels really cool to see Mewtwo come back in a proper Pokemon film, and Mewtwo still as great as ever, although it comes with a price. This is not the same Mewtwo from the first movie, or Mewtwo Returns. Although they have the same backstory, they don't have the same kind of personality, and they don't even have the same voice. In this movie, Mewtwo has a more feminine voice, which doesn't sound like it fits to me. I just can't imagine Mewtwo sounding like a woman when I got used to either Jay Goad or Dan Green voicing Mewtwo. She also has the ability to become Awakened Mewtwo, or Mega Mewtwo Y, and I think her design is okay, and she's real fast, but it is a little silly to see her tail on her head. As for the Genesect, I think the design is cool. They're not traditional animals that you usually see mythicals like. They're more designed to look more robotic and technological, sort of like Deoxys in a way. They're like Transformers where they can change their forms. There is a Genesect that Ash and friends end up befriending, even if she can't disobey the authoritative Red Genesect who's ordering her to attack her friends. You end up feeling kind of sorry for her. I also like how they decided to try and link Mewtwo and Genesect's backstories, since both of them were created by humans, so in a way it gives them a bit of chemistry, which I appreciate. So overall, would I say this movie rocks? Not at all. This movie can be dragged out sometimes. Giving Mewtwo a female voice feels questionable, and Iris and Cylon are still as bland and forgettable as ever. But hey, considering what I had to put up with the soporific movie 14 and the infuriating movie 15, I think even if movie 16 wasn't a masterpiece, I appreciate that it was trying to be at least competent. And hey, Team Rocket makes an appearance again, so you can't say they weren't trying to improve. Now we're heading on to the X and Y films, and of which there are 3 of them. I mean, this will be a pretty fast romp, and according to a friend of mine, he considers this movie to be his personal favourite. And I can actually see why. Considering how the last generation of films consisted of films that were boring, trash, and flawed, I'm happy to say that this one is a very big improvement, and is actually fun. I'd say that the pacing in this movie is much more improved over the previous generation, as it doesn't feel too slow nor too fast. The action and battles in this one, such as the one with Yveltal, felt more fun and satisfying to sit through, and can be quite nail-biting at points. The villains in this one, Marilyn Flame and Ninja Riot, although they aren't the best written villains, the fact they're entertaining to watch more than makes up for it. It also helps that they're a pair of thieves, so it gives that vibe of Annie and Oakley from Pokemon Heroes. I did also enjoy Millie, and I will admit, her becoming a villain was a surprise to me. Her dad's love for chocolate was also relatable. I just enjoyed that we have villains that try to be more enjoyable than to be threatening and failing at it. Also, for once, Team Rocket actually does something useful compared to what they did in the previous bunch of films, so that's commendable. And as for this movie's mythical Diancie, as someone who has never even heard about that Pokemon until today, I'm not gonna lie, I think she just gained a fan. Sure, she might be a little playful and naive, but that's what makes her so enjoyable to watch. She's also cute, she's willing to learn new things, and plus her diamond creating powers are admittedly really cool, along with the diamond domain that she lives in, which looks beautifully animated and designed. She, along with her kind, are also searching for Xerneas, so that she can give Fairy Aura to Diancie, so she can create a new diamond heart to power it after it becomes destroyed. Man, it feels so good to see a mythical Pokemon do something really cool and make them feel special. That's what the previous generation's films were missing, so that this movie has. So in the end, I would say that after what I went through with Black and White, it sure feels great to finally get back to the good stuff with X and Y. And this movie's got plenty of good for me to enjoy it, that I'd go as far as to find it among the true best. I'd even go as far as to say the friends Ash has this generation are better than the ones in Black and White, as at least Serena, Bonnie and Clemence's personalities and traits are more memorable than that of Iris and Sylan. I just had so much fun with this movie, and you know what? I think my friend's right. This movie definitely is worthy of being his favorite. Sounds like a lot of Hoopa to make over a little Pokemon movie, right? Haha, wrong! I will say though, this movie's setting was pretty interesting. This time we got to have a desert setting, which for a Pokemon movie feels like a breath of fresh air. Granted, it might not be the most unique setting to make your movie, but it feels nice to see it in a movie like this. The story itself is fine, if a little bit basic, with its get from point A to point B kind of plot, though I did like the idea of a bottle to seal off powers. Although seeing the legendary Pokemon in this movie is kinda cool, it does feel like a gimmick used to sell the movie, which to be fair, is super effective. I do like the characters of Baraz and Murray, and how they take good care of Hoopa. I thought that was pretty sweet. I also appreciate them using Hoopa's Unbound form as the antagonist of the film. Speaking of Hoopa, I thought he's an interesting character. His design looks pretty neat, his backstory was interesting, and he also has really cool powers, using his rings to summon things, and use them like portals a la the Portal games, but I feel like he could be annoying at times. In both his confined and unbound form, he refers to himself in the third person. I'm not a fan of his voice, and how he tends to repeat a lot of the things that he says. Still, he's not quite as infuriatingly annoying as Shaman, because at least he's not a dick, and when he does mischief, it's not out of malice, and it can be funny. Plus his powers are way cooler than Shaman's anyway, and he legit cares for Ash, or AshCon, which makes him sound a lot like a convention. Unfortunately, this movie wasn't as strong as the last film, but on the bright side, at least it's still a fun time. It might have flaws, but I can't stay mad at this film, since it does try to be enjoyable with its action, characters, and chemistry. My friend actually admits this to be a guilty pleasure for him, and hey, I'm not one to take that away from him, like the bottle took away Hoopa's powers. Now I want to have a Hoopa of my own. I'm still waiting on my $1,000,000. How else am I going to buy all the cheeseburgers in the world? I thought the idea of a city of cogs with the Azoth Kingdom looked really cool and gave it a bit of a steampunk vibe, especially with the well done animation done in those areas. The action is what you expect from a Pokemon movie, epic and grandiose. Not quite as good as the action in movie 17 in my opinion, but still quite fun. The villain Counselor Alva, although a little overdone at this point, what with him using Magearna's so hard to take control of the mechanical city, was kinda cool and definitely sinister. I mean, if you can make Meowth, Team Rocket's Pokemon, feel sorry for Magearna, then you've made yourself a pretty good villain. Magearna herself looked like a really adorable Pokemon, and the voice she makes sounds really cute too. I find it interesting that she's an artificial Pokemon, so it feels unique. It also felt great to see how Magearna bonded between Serena and Bonnie. This movie could have a bit of humor in here too, mainly with either Magearna's shenanigans or with the bond between Volcanion and Ash. Sure, it might not have been laugh out loud funny, but it was definitely giggle worthy. I also really liked the characters of Raleigh and Kimia, especially how when you eventually feel sorry for the former of how Alba betrayed him and how Kimia was a kind character in general. I thought that Volcanion was a pretty cool character and an absolute unit. Sure, his hatred towards humans might feel like it was recycled from Lucario in movie 8 and he could be really stubborn, but I find it interesting how he was bonded with Ash on his rescue mission to save Magearna's soul heart, and also, much like Lucario, he does grow to like Ash and company. Although his powers weren't my most favourite, I think they're still pretty cool in their own right, and a mist power is still pretty powerful. It was also fun to learn about the backstory between him and Magearna and how they grew to be friends before they got separated. That was sweet. But do you want to know the best part about Volcanion? Mike Pollock voices him. That's right, the voice of this movie's mythical Volcanion is provided by Dr. Eggman himself. Now that is a pretty awesome sentence to say. Overall, this movie isn't perfect, but I don't think it had to be enjoyable. I definitely had a lot of fun with this one, with its action, its setting, its characters, its heart and all that. My one complaint is that I felt it took a few things from the other Pokemon movies, but on the plus side, at least it took the good Pokemon movies, and that's the end of the Pokemon X and Y movies, as well as the last time we get to see anything related to the anime itself. Starting with the next movies, they will all be in an alternate reality, not connected with the series. This is going to be interesting. We're now on Generation 7 of the Pokemon movies, which means we're going to be focusing less on sticking with the anime and more on trying its own thing with its alternate reality shtick. Sounds like an old concept. The only issue is I remember when this particular movie came out, people were not happy. They were complaining about the fact that despite this being a retelling of Ash's backstory and how he got his Pikachu, etc., Misty and Brock weren't in it, which sure did piss off a lot of people. But you know what? I've kind of been more forgiving to that, especially since this is an alternate reality after all. But hey, they decided to make a retelling of Ash's movies, movie 20, and to celebrate 20 years of the Pokemon anime. And what do I think of this entry? Pretty good actually. I will say that I actually really enjoyed the approach this movie goes for. Instead of doing what I usually did with legendaries and mythicals, it decides to, as previously stated, go through a retelling of the origins of Ash and how he became a Pokemon trainer. And I feel it does it quite well. And they go through the same beats of the original anime, like how he got his Pikachu, how they had a very rocky relationship from the very start, failing to catch a Pidgey, hitting a Spearow with a rock in an attempt to battle him, Caterpie being the first Pokemon he successfully catches, etc. Granted, it may not be all one-to-one, but I'd say they did go through all the fundamentals pretty well, and it was made to be accessible whether you've seen the anime or not. I feel this movie had a good amount of humor in it too, mainly with Ash's shenanigans and how Pikachu can be stubborn at points, and pretty much all the moments with Team Rocket, and I think it's at least worthy of a giggle. I do also think this movie, like most of the other Pokemon movies, has a lot of heart, especially when you see the chemistry between Ash and Pikachu grow, or seeing Ash let go of Butterfree. It felt very sweet to watch. The animation was, as you'd expect, beautiful as well, especially when you see the effects of the world around Ash, as well as the lighting of the different areas, especially the reds, to give off that nostalgic sunset or sunrise vibe. The action is rampant and is awesome to watch and very satisfying, especially seeing the battles between Ash's Charmeleon and later Charizard, and Cross's Incineroar and the battle against Pikachu and Marshadow. Although they aren't as much of a focus as other Pokemon movies, I thought this movie's legendary and mythical, Ho-Oh and Marshadow, were pretty nice to see. Ho-Oh was a great unit to see, and his design was absolutely great. He was one of the first legendaries Ash sees, even getting a feather that fell from him. And for Marshadow, man, was it trippy to see him get inside the mind of Ash, to imagine a world where Pokemon never existed, to teach him a lesson about needing friends after they had an argument. In a way, he's sort of like Ash's guardian angel, which felt nice. What wasn't so nice, though, was the fact that eventually he possessed all the different Pokemon that caused them to attack Ash, so maybe he's more of a guardian devil. But now we get to the elephant in the room, Verity and Sorrel, aka the replacements of Misty and Brock, and the ones everyone hates as a result. Look, I think it's more important to focus on them as characters and how they're written rather than if they replace anyone. And I feel they're written well. I actually liked Verity. Although she wasn't as good as Misty, she still was a well-written character with a competitive personality and cute design. As for Sorrel, although he could be kind of brash at times, he does genuinely care about his friends and for Pokemon, like when he tried to cure an abandoned Charmander that a dickish trainer Cross left behind, and his backstory on making friends with Pokemon was fascinating. Speaking of Cross, he's more or less Ash's rival in it, and man was he such an asshole at the start, giving such lack of encouragement towards Ash. However, I did like how his character developed as Marshadow possessed a different Pokemon, including his own Lycanroc, so he went back to being likable. Going back to Verity and Sorrel, and honestly, I don't think I would want Misty and Brock here. Don't get me wrong, they're awesome characters, but if you're doing a retelling, especially one set in an alternate reality, then as far as I'm concerned, you're allowed to take some creative liberty. If Misty and Brock were in this movie, then there would be no reason for it to exist. It's like how the movie The Shining is different from the book The Shining. Try to keep the spirit while making it different so that both the original and the retelling have a reason to exist. Although Verity and Sorrel weren't as good or fleshed out as Misty and Brock, I wouldn't say they're bad characters by any means. And man, seeing the ending felt so emotional and rough, seeing as what was essentially Ash as he was hugging Pikachu tightly, and Pikachu finally getting in a Pokemon for the first time. I did tell you what fell off though. Pikachu speaking. And no, I don't just mean Pikachu. I mean Pikachu actually speaking English.
Pikachu, why won't you get in your Pokeball?
It's because I always want to be with you.
It felt so wrong. I mean, I suppose it's a fitting voice, and I know it was just 2 lines of dialogue, but maybe don't make him talk. But man, seeing Ash in the Dream Zone as Pikachu missed Ash felt so rough, but I felt happy to see them together. I know I had a lot to say about this movie, but it's because this movie offered a whole lot. I think this movie is a great introductory movie for Pokemon newcomers. Sure, it might not be 100% accurate to the anime, but if you read it being an alternate reality, would you really expect it to be? I love the callbacks, the heart, the characters, and we get to know about Ash and his personality. Sure, it's not perfect, but I can't help but enjoy this one. And there was me expecting to hate it just because Misty and Brock weren't in it. In a way, I choose you as a perfect title for this movie, because I can certainly choose it to be among the most enjoyable Pokemon experiences. For the second movie in the alternate reality era of Pokemon, I had no idea what to expect, especially considering that the director of every single other Pokemon movie, Kunihiko Yuyama, actually didn't direct this one. But I was still intrigued, especially since I made it this far in my Pokemon movie binge. This movie tries something different and actually features multiple different characters to follow. It's pretty unique for one of the Pokemon movies to do. All of this is based around the annual Wind Festival in Fueless City, but we see all these different characters, each with their own motives and background. Of course, we have Ash Ketchum and Pikachu who want to participate in a contest, but we also have Risa, a former runner who promised her brother Rick to catch an Eevee for him, so that's why she's at the festival. There's Harriet, an old lady who hates Pokemon that has sweet scent accidentally spilled on her, so the Pokemon constantly follow her. And there's Callahan, who is a massive liar just to make his niece Kelly happy. We got Margot, who is a little girl that's the mayor's daughter, and there's Tord, a shy scientist who is also a con artist. For the most part, I feel like they do this really well, especially when you see the chemistry grow on the many different characters, such as Ash with Risa. I think it's really cool to see a Pokemon movie that tries to focus on character building, which makes this feel unique from other Pokemon movies preceding it. If you're the kind of person that enjoys watching Pokemon strictly for the battles though, you might be a little bit disappointed. There isn't as much action or battles here than there are usually in Pokemon movies. Admittedly, I am a bit bummed out about it too, especially since I always imagine that's why people go to see these movies. I suppose we did have 20 movies worth of battles. It does feel nice to have something more laid back than something super intense for once. However, that isn't to say it has 0 battles whatsoever. There was a battle near the start with Ash battling one of the kids with the lemonade stand, or when Ash was showing Risa how to do Pokemon battles against an Eevee, but in terms of an epic battle at the end, unfortunately you won't find one. It focuses more on being a mystery of sorts, which I'm perfectly fine with. Seeing all the different events happen which lead to another, such as finding out where the bottle of effect spore is, and the overall mystery of the entire events before the festival, it felt really fascinating. So it still stays interesting, and more importantly, unpredictable, even with fewer battles. Much like the previous Pokemon movie, there is a legendary and mythical in it, Lugia and Zeraora respectively, although they don't play as big of a role as previous legendaries and mythicals. We have seen Lugia in movies before, in movies 2 and 18, but since I always thought he was great, I'll let him slide. As with previous appearances, he is absolutely awesome, with a great design and powers. However, like Ho-Oh from the previous movie, Lugia doesn't appear a lot, but for what little he's in it, he proves to be useful. As for Zeraora, well, for a decent bunch of the film, you don't actually see him in motion. You hear tales from the different townsfolk in the film, and it is rumoured that all the threats and vandalism happening in Fueless City are caused by him. But it's not until around the 50-minute mark where we see him in action, protecting Margot after 2 nasty hunters try to capture him. I thought his design was pretty cool, and I love how he cares for Margot, like when we see her backstory with Zeraora saving her. It was also interesting to see his backstory with himself, and how he really cares for the Pokemon in the forest, and later on, people of Fueless City. Overall, this movie is a pleasant surprise to both hardcore and casual Pokemon aficionados. The animation is amazing, the characters are fascinating and deep, and the story is simple but fun. I personally prefer I Choose You over this due to it having a bit more action, and no liar reveal trope, but this is still a solid film worth 93 minutes of your time. I mean, why else would be the first Pokemon movie to receive a fresh score on Rotten Tomatoes? I remember when this movie came out and got good reviews. It was a pretty big deal. Bear in mind, this came out before the Sonic movies, so to see a movie based on a video game to get at least passable scores, in a time when video game movies still had an awful reputation, was pretty wild. But is this movie as bad as any of these movies I mentioned, or is it actually a good video game movie for once? Let's find out! This is based loosely on the 3DS game Detective Pikachu, and I think they adapted well for the screen. It feels like a well-deserved break from the more action-oriented anime. I actually really enjoy this movie's story about Tim, along with his partner Pikachu, voiced by Ryan Reynolds, going through the mystery of Tim's father's disappearance and trying to gather clues on whether he's dead or not. I think it actually does a good job of not being predictable, and it feels exciting to see how the story itself unfolds with each clue being given. It feels like a breath of fresh air to people that always have been watching the anime movies. The setting of Rhyme City is almost so great, while with it being a very high-tech and more or less everyone here has a Pokemon of their very own. It helps how the city itself looks very lively. Admittedly, I'd like to live there. It's also full of different Pokemon references and Easter eggs that you'd need to have a very sharp eye to see. The Pokemon themselves, from Pikachu to Gengar to Charizard and even Mewtwo, actually look awesome as well. They basically took the traditional Pokemon designs and made them look realistic, but didn't crank it all the way to 11. They balanced it so that you can very easily tell how the Pokemon themselves are feeling, which if you're doing a movie that tries to do realistic animation, especially one based on pocket monsters, I feel like a balance between realism and emotion is good. And as for Pikachu himself, he was great. I found it to be very enjoyable and very entertaining. I mean, he's voiced by Deadpool, so of course he's going to have a lot of entertaining quips and lines. And of course, I do like how Tim and Pikachu's chemistry grew as the movie progressed, and there were even some emotional moments between the two. And there is action too, which was excellently crafted. It might not be perfect. I know some lines might have fallen flat, but that's a thankfully small amount. And personally, I prefer the Sonic movies over this. But still, for a movie based on a video game, as opposed to a movie based on an anime based on a video game, I'd say it's a really good job with its different elements. And I'm so happy to say that this movie already ranks high on my Pokemon movie ranking. Not bad for a film directed by the directors Shark Tale and Gulliver's Travels. No, really, that's the same guy. Look it up. I'm not joking. You think I'm joking? Look it up. Now I've read several listicles talking about every Pokemon movie ranked, and one thing I notice in a lot of them is that this movie is usually very low, often talking about how it wasn't necessary for this remake to exist, and talking about the animation. The thing is that most people only say this because they consider the first movie a classic with no issues whatsoever in need of fixing. But there's one problem I have with this. I don't like the first movie. It might have started the Pokemon movies, and without it we wouldn't have any of the good movies, but it had a cliched villain, an ending that feels like you wasted life, cringy humor, weird song choices, and worst of all, an anti-violence message in a movie based on a series all about fighting. So with all these flaws brought up here, I think a remake could have the potential to fix some, if not all, of the flaws that the original had. After all, 4Kids and Kids WB couldn't ruin the script to add hypocrisy and songs that don't fit anymore, making it more accurate to the Japanese original. And I think this is a similar case to something like the Coen brothers' True Grit, in that the remake is actually better than the original. Although the story was more or less the same, I felt this had some improvements. For one, Mewtwo's backstory was better explained here, and better yet, Mewtwo wasn't some kind of mustache or lack thereof twirler. Although still antagonistic, he was written like how he was in the original Japanese version and in Mewtwo Returns, where he is a more misunderstood and somewhat sympathetic character. I was very happy to hear that the humor was a little better here too. And Ash never made that stupid Minnesota Vikings joke, especially since Team Rocket are sailors here and not Vikings. And most importantly, no hypocritical message! Yes! Man, it feels great to finally say that about the first movie. Instead, the message is that it shouldn't matter if they're a regular Pokemon or a clone, they're still a living thing equally. It may not be the most original message, but at least it's not hypocritical, so I'm happy that we got that instead of an anti-violence message in the series about fighting. And not only that, but although this is a remake of the first movie, it actually introduces the world a little better than in the original, which, just to remind you, was released when Pokemon was still in its infancy, and was the first Pokemon movie, so it feels like it wasn't a good starting point. However, in 2019, when practically everyone knows about Pokemon and how it works, it feels better than how it was originally. The animation is an interesting case. You've probably noticed that this is the first, and so far only, Pokemon movie to be created entirely in CGI. And for what it is, I think it's done pretty well. The settings, effects, and lighting look really well done for Pokemon's first fully CGI outing. The thing that might put off some people, however, might be the characters' models. I admit that once I first saw them, it felt pretty weird at first, since I wasn't used to seeing Pokemon characters, and especially humans, animated in CGI. But you know what? After some time, I actually got used to seeing them like this. To me, I feel like the CGI was mainly an experiment to see if they could try making CGI movies, and I'm sure they can. It does take some time to improve after all. Were there any flaws retained from the first movie? Well, to be frank, yes. Thankfully, there were the more somewhat minor flaws of the film, the first being the Pokemon Tears scene. Yes, that scene's back, and I still can't take it seriously, and it's still a ridiculous Deus Ex Machina. And the ending is still the same, what with Mewtwo erasing the memories of everyone, which was annoying for sure, though considering I didn't hate that as much as having the hypocritical message, I guess they chose the better flaw to keep. And plus, it wasn't the Japanese original anyway, so that can't really change. But overall, would I say this movie is perfect? No. Would I say that they definitely tried to make this movie better by fixing as many flaws as they can? Yes! So although this isn't a perfect film, I'd go as far as to say that this is my preferred way to revisit the first movie. This is a CGI remake that I feel like does a good job at trying to stand out against the original. If I recommend you any version of the first movie, it's this one. It does suck how we never got this movie 20 years prior, but I guess better late than never. Well, we made it, folks. The latest Pokemon movie, the grand finale, the epic conclusion, the last stand, the final frontier, the ultimate showdown of ultimate destiny. One thing I noticed when watching this film is that the movie felt very familiar. In fact, the general setup is pretty much the same as Tarzan. Basically, a group of Zarudes, instead of apes, find a lost child, and against the law of the other members of the clan, the Zarude, named Dada, takes care of the child, who he names Coco, to make sure it grows up, complete with a little montage. Eventually, Coco discovers he's not actually a Zarude, and has to decide on who to stay with, the Zarudes or the humans. Did any of that sound familiar? Well, if it did, then it's very likely you've probably seen Tarzan as well. As a matter of fact, it's so much like Tarzan that's not even subtle about it. Not only does the basic plot feel the same, but so do the characters themselves. Coco is the Tarzan counterpart, minus the plane crash bit, and he can talk to Pokemon as opposed to apes, and was surprised to know that he was a human. Dada is the Kala counterpart, who raises Coco. Alpha is the Kachak counterpart, who is reluctant to have Coco as part of his family. Sharon is the Jane counterpart, and even she's working for Dr. Zed, the Clayton counterpart, just like the Porters did. As a result, it's sort of difficult to appreciate these characters on account that they're too similar to other characters, so they don't really stand out. Not even the animation, for as awesome as it looks with its lighting, background style, etc., can make me feel happy, because I noticed a lot of the parts felt very similar to Tarzan, like when Coco and Ash touched palms, just like Jane and Tarzan did, or whenever Coco was jumping through the vines. They're not even being subtle. It really sucks. But I don't want this particular review, especially the last Pokemon movie, to be, this movie's just Tarzan again. So I just get to the other parts I like. The character designs actually look really nice. I thought the Zarudes looked like big units and were enjoyable to watch, especially since they were a tribe, so it was great to see them so loyal to each other. And to be fair, not all of the scenes are the same as Tarzan, like the scene where Ash shows Coco all different kinds of human activities. We also helped grow the chemistry between Ash and Coco, and I'd lie if I'd say the humor didn't make me laugh. Again, it wasn't heavy laughs, but it was the sort of laugh that you could get from something enjoyable. Dr. Zed, although he's the Clayton counterpart, is pretty threatening, what with his plans threatening the Pokemon's habitat. And do I need to say anything about the battles? I feel like I'd be repeating myself on them. Seeing all the Pokemon of the jungle going up and battling against Dr. Zed felt very satisfying, especially since, like Kodai from movie 13, he does get his comeuppance. Overall, I wouldn't describe this movie as being awful per se, but man, this is probably the first time where I see a Pokemon movie straight up use elements from another film, especially a film from the Disney Renaissance, and unfortunately, it loses a lot of personality because of it. It really is a shame. Maybe it's possible that COVID-19 had a play in this, which might have affected this movie and its writing, which is why I'm not mad or heavily harsh at it. But man, it really sucks that for the latest Pokemon movie to see, it lacks a personality, which is something that even the black and white movies accomplished. And yes, it hurts that I said that. Whew, that was quite an ordeal, having to watch 25 movies, which were hours worth of content and different Pokemon. Some were great, some were crap, some were awesome, some were garbage. But this confirms that the Pokemon movies are all over the place in terms of quality. Is it really a surprise that critics and fans have a hard time trying to figure out which movies are good or bad at this point? I don't think so. But I'm not gonna lie, I did have a fun time going through all these different movies. Because if critics were to take their Pokemon hatred aside, there were some legitimate hidden gems here. Granted, not all of them were masterpieces, but when you've been making films annually since 1998, you're not expected to get all winners. But now the age-old question remains, how are each film ranked? Well, from worst to best. Starting off at the dead last position, we have the worst Pokemon movie at number 25, Pokemon Kyurem vs. the Sword of Justice. At number 24, we have Pokemon Giratina and the Sky Warrior. At number 23, we have Pokemon the First Movie. At number 22, we have a tie between Pokemon the Movie Black, Victini and Reshiram, and Pokemon the Movie White, Victini and Zekrom, because they're basically the same film. At number 21, we have Pokemon Ranger and the Temple of the Sea. At number 20, we have Pokemon Genesect and the Legend Awakened. At number 19, we have Pokemon Secrets of the Jungle. At number 18, we have Pokemon Destiny Deoxys. At number 17, we have Pokemon Mewtwo Returns. At number 16, we have Pokemon the Movie 2000. At number 15, we have Pokemon Hoopa and the Clash of Ages. At number 14, we have Pokemon Arceus or Arceus and the Jewel of Life. At number 13, we have Pokemon The Power of Us. At number 12, we have Pokemon Mewtwo Strikes Back Evolution. At number 11, we have Pokemon Forever. At number 10, we have Pokemon Heroes. At number 9, we have Pokemon I Choose You. At number 8, we have Pokemon Volcanion and the Mechanical Marvel. At number 7, we have Pokemon The Rise of Darkrai. At number 6, we have Pokemon Jirachi Wishmaker. At number 5, we have Pokemon Zoroark Master of Illusions. At number 4, we have Pokemon Lucario and the Mystery of Mew. At number 3, the bronze position, Pokemon Diancie and the Cocoon of Destruction. At number 2, the silver position, Pokemon 3, the movie. At number 1, the best Pokemon movie of all, the gold position, Pokemon Detective Pikachu. So, now that we got 25 Pokemon movies, the only question left is, what next? What other Pokemon movies could possibly happen at this stage? As of the making of this video, there aren't any new Pokemon movies in the works, and the fact that Ash Ketchum is leaving the anime after 25 years of being on there pretty much confirms that Ash won't even be the protagonist should there be a new film. But merely the fact they haven't even announced a new Pokemon movie since 2020 is a sign that the filmmakers are satisfied with the amount of movies they have right now. And besides, there's no rule saying they have to make a Pokemon movie every single year. Realistically, that sounds like a nightmare in production. And considering how some of the movies were like, especially movies 11, 14, and 15, it could explain a whole lot. So for now, I'm not expecting them to make a new Pokemon movie anytime soon. But hey, if Detective Pikachu 2 isn't totally cancelled and they do end up making it, I'm totally up to seeing that. But basically, in terms of Pokemon movies in general, we need a well-deserved break. I already feel worn out from watching them, so God knows how it must be to make them. Alrighty, that's the end of this really long video that I made about Pokemon movies. This is WorldJ2012, signing out.